Welcome to the Attract Your Ideal Clients podcast. This show is for entrepreneurs who sell their expertise, including trainers, consultants, and coaches looking for real world, actionable marketing advice to help them identify their competitive strengths, find and fix the marketing bottlenecks that are holding them back, and confidently make the right marketing decisions for their unique business. In today's episode, I'll be talking with Darby Walsh from Delta Business Strategies about some of the challenges he faces when initiating conversations with potential prospects. Issues like feeling like he's imposing on them or taking up their time. Now, if you can relate, we'll unpack some ways to reframe your approach and open up opportunities to engage people in a way that's not only more comfortable for you, but it makes each conversation much more enjoyable for everyone involved. Now, before we get started, if you've hit a plateau in your training, consulting, or coaching business, I want to invite you to visit marcusschaller.com/subscribe for weekly troubleshooting guides and tips to help you find and fix the weak spots in your marketing that are holding you back, fine-tune your positioning and marketing strategy, and start growing again by attracting more of your ideal clients. Again, that's marcusschaller.com/subscribe. Today, we're going to talk about some of the things that you had mentioned last time we spoke about the kind of marketing challenges that you face. And it's not necessarily just technical stuff, although we can talk about that, tactical things as well. But the way you described it, just to kind of set the table a little bit, and then I'll just hand the mic over to you to elaborate, is really this idea of like when you're reaching out to people or you're initiating conversations with potential clients, this sense, it's almost like an emotional thing, right? It's a sense of, am I an inconvenience? Am I bothering them somehow, right? And I think that's definitely something I can relate to for sure. I'm sure a lot of people listening can relate to that. So just to start us out, I just want to hand it over to you. Can you just kind of share with everybody what that really means to you and basically what you're facing when you're trying to kind of like build your outbound prospecting kind of thing?
Yeah, so it's sometimes it can be a daunting thing, especially depending on the type of person you are. I'm definitely an introvert. I'm not a marketer. Matter of fact, I didn't like my marketing classes, and quite frankly, I didn't pay very much attention. But when you look at it, like you need to have a piece of this person's time to convey your message, and you're reading body cues or whatever your message is or however you're delivering it. I always sometimes feel that I'm imposing. And to me, I know how I feel when my time is being imposed on. I don't mind wasting my own time, but I don't want other people wasting mine. Uh, and I feel like I need to be quick. I feel like I need to like strike fast or something along those lines. And I may subvert my own message sometimes because I'm not like this skilled marketer, this skilled salesperson. I know what I know. I'm an operations guy, and I know what I know, and I know what I do well. Uh, but I also know that I have to sell myself and I have to sell my business. Um, Imposing on other people's valuable time uh, has been a big kind of speed bump in my head, and I thoughtfully try to say, "Don't worry about it. Get your message across, and go for it." And sometimes I'm successful, sometimes I'm not.
Yeah, I'm so glad we can talk about this because I think it's such, again, for myself as well, it's such a common pain point, right? You're in this sense of you're trying to start conversations because it all comes down to conversations, right? When you're building your client base, it starts there. And what can happen is there can be this implied notion that, well, let's just say selling yourself, whatever that means, right? Means content, means getting your message across, right? And what can happen, as to your point, it can create this feeling that you have to rush through it, right? That the clock is ticking, right?
Right.
And so with your permission, let's dig into that because again, this is almost like we're gonna kind of troubleshoot this a little bit together. And I appreciate so much that you're willing to do this, breaking the fourth wall, right? And including other people to listen into this and be flies on the wall. But first of all, just let's just create a little context and a visual. What would this look like? Is it you reach out to somebody and you book an intro call kind of thing? Is it on Zoom? Just give us an idea of what it might look like.
Yeah, sure. And I think that that's part of my that's another part of my problem is getting to that point of having somebody engaged. Because for me, I don't find there's a lot of people that do what I do. So I help clients document and implement their processes. So there's not a lot of us running around. It's not like lawyers or whatever. And so I kind of have this niche market where people have to be in the mindset that they're in the market for this work, or at least that I have something that I can do for them to alleviate a problem of theirs. Uh, and so if it's a cold start, it's even harder for me than it is when it's a warm start, or if somebody has said, "Hey, you know, tell me more about this because I'm interested. I don't have anything documented." That's an easy one for me. The cold ones, because most folks don't equate necessarily process documentation with a problem that they're having. Uh, and so to get that conversation going, what do you do? Oh, I document processes and help you implement it into your training. Oh, and a lot of times that's about it. It just goes that far, because I don't know. It's not a sexy topic. It's not cool to talk about. I don't feel like, but it's fundamentally important to most businesses.
Yeah, it's again, this is such a, especially for you're doing coaching or consulting or the training work where it's something that's not like you said, a lawyer, right? Even though it's not trained or whatever, but it's something everybody understands it, right? There's a
Yeah,
downside to that sometimes too, because they people will go in with their own ideas about what that means, right? So if somebody says
sure.
lawyer, they're like, oh, whatever. No offense to lawyers, of course.
No, no, for sure.
But yeah, that's interesting because you said that when it's a warm conversation, it's easier, and when it's cold, that's where it's challenging. So my question to you is to kind of start finding where these little bottlenecks might be is let's say it's a warm conversation, right? I'm assuming, and you tell me if I'm wrong, that that's somebody who you either know through personal connection, know through LinkedIn, but it's a little easier. It's more of a conversation. Like when you and I met, it's more like we're just chatting at first, and then there's more of an organic opportunity to kind of talk business. Is that near
Yep.
the bullseye there?
Yeah. Yep.
So what what happens at the beginning? Do you feel that there's a pressure for you to pitch to basically give your message, or, and it might be a little both, but is it that you start with questions about a specific problem, and we can talk a little bit in a minute about how to actually frame that, right? Because it's hard
Yeah.
to your point. But which does it look like more, do you think?
So for me, I love that question because for me, uh, I I want to hear about your problems because when I hear about your problems, that's what I do is I use my skills to help solve something, right? I mean, that's what everybody needs to do. Everybody needs to solve something. Uh, but when my methodology is, I'll tell you what I do, but then I immediately start to turn the conversation. I want to hear you talk. I want you to talk about because whoever I'm talking to is far more interested in what they have to say than what I have to say. So I start to probe with just a whole bunch of questions. Um, Tell me about this. Tell me about that, and they inevitably come up with something that they're struggling with because I will steer that conversation into, well, why does that happen, or how do you feel about that? What does your team, do with this or that? That really is where I start to see my success. And it has to be more of this for me because my personality. It has to be more of this unstructured kind of conversation. if I go into this pitch, I sound so phony. I start to stutter and stumble over things. I worry about how fast I'm going and delivering the right thing. Whereas I get you talking, I just listen. Uh, that's where it helps for me, and that's what I've developed over time. The other the other part that ties back into the front part of the conversation is that when I'm doing that, now if I'm successful in getting there, I don't feel as I'm imposing on your time as much, right? Now you're kind of controlling the conversation, at least you think you are. Uh and and you're telling me about you, which is what I need to uncover. Uh,
Everything, I was obviously not on camera. Everything you're saying, I'm like nodding furiously because I just totally agree. I mean, it's absolutely the right, in my opinion, and a lot of people's opinion, that's the right perspective to take, right? You're not there to dump a bunch of information on somebody and talk about yourself. It's really about understanding somebody first, and the best way to do that is to questions and, to your point, not be rigid about it. You get something to get it started, of course, but you really want to just be curious. Now, what's the difference then when it's a cold conversation? So you said like when a cold conversation, those are the most challenging for you to not feel like you're imposing. So my guess, and again, tell me if I'm wrong, but the way I picture that is it harder for you to get somebody else talking in a cold conversation where you feel like there's a little bit more messaging on your side to set up the context of the conversation? What would be the difference between the warm and the cold, basically?
it's now that you put it the way you just put it, right? Like there shouldn't be really any difference as long as I use probably the same tactic. Uh, Maybe it's more internal that I'm just uncomfortable with starting that conversation, right? I'm not the kind of guy that's going to go up and introduce myself to a bunch of people that are standing around, at a conference at happy hour or whatever. Like that's just not who I am. It's very painful for me to do that. Um, but what I should be doing is, I should be. This is very interesting. What I should be doing is asking those questions, start off with those questions, and then automatically steer it before I even introduce what I do, as as uninteresting as it may be to other people. Um, that's interesting. It's kind of like this little like light bulb just went off.
Well, then my job is done, sir.
Yeah.
No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. No, that's my greatest hope in these kinds of conversations. It's like again, helping you kind of walk through some of these scenarios and maybe a way that wasn't automatic before, right? So
Right.
I don't want to interrupt your flow, right? So certainly let that gel a little bit. But I did want to take the opportunity to think in terms of also one other piece to this puzzle that you mentioned earlier was the challenge in expressing what you do in a way that's a specific problem. I'm paraphrasing a bit, but you said earlier about like, hey, if I say that I'm in, process documentation. Am I remembering that
Yep.
correctly? Okay.
Yep.
Process documentation. You know, People, okay, like you said, it's not sexy, right? Are there ways that you have thought of or might think of to express process documentation, not from that, this is what I do, but specific problems that you might solve? And more so, I know there's a bunch of problems that might exist there. One way to think about it is there kind of a tip of the spear problem? So your ideal clients, they might have a variety of different challenges, but there are two or three or four or something like that that all of them tend to have, and that problem or those problems tend to be the a good initiating point, if that makes sense. Are there any problems like that that you can think of?
That's a common problem.
It doesn't have to be common among all of them, but basically, like, if I were to ask you, like, hey, what do you think the most top of mind problem that your best clients have that you
Yeah.
solve? Like, just thinking, turning the around from being about I'm in process documentation, like almost forgetting about that for a second, and just
Right.
thinking purely in terms of if somebody say, what are the problems you solve? You're just kind of saying, this is what I help people figure out.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the people problem is what it is. Everybody has a people problem. Um, whether it's the employee that doesn't perform well, it's the overtasked star performer, it's the unengaged what I'll say millennial, but that's the stereotype, right? Um, but it's always everybody has a people problem. And so one of the things I've learned over the years, and I'm not really sure I even got this, is that most problems can be whittled down to one of three things: people, process, or a tool. And if you can take those, or a combination of a couple of those, and if you can take those and whittle those down to the root cause of people, process, or tool, right? Then you can a lot of times solve their problem with using that methodology, right? Certainly, if you have a tool, if your machines are broken or whatever, that's a maintenance problem. That's a maintenance process problem. If you just have the wrong machines or the wrong tools or whatever, right, then that's different. Um, but most everybody has a people problem, and a lot of times that people problem centers around training. Uh, and people don't train to their core processes, right? So for that question, right, for that conversation starter, or how to crack into their time without being intrusive, right? It's probably what's your people problem, or what's the problem that keeps you up at night with in regards to your people. Everybody has a people problem.
And let's dig into this a little bit too. When you think about people problem, right? If, like, let's say you describe to me, everybody has a people problem. Like that could mean a million things, right? Like it could mean, well, the people problem is that we're churning employees. It can mean that we're getting sued. It could be like a lot of things. I know you can't specify one thing, but can you think about what the people problem might look like if I'm the CEO. So I'm guessing at this that you're dealing with the leadership, right? You're dealing with the founder, the CEO,
Yes.
right? So I'm
Yep.
the CEO, right? And when I think about people problem, what are a couple of different ways that actually looks, does that actually look like? If you didn't even use the word people problem, right? What would that actually look like? I'm churning through employees. I'm just making stuff up, but just do you have any
Yep.
idea of what that might look like? And
Yeah.
what
Yeah.
would be and also what would be the impact? So it's like you're churning through people, and what happens then is, you're losing sales. You know what I'm saying, right?
Yep. Yeah. So I always have this when I start a session with a client, and sometimes when I'm having just that general conversation, I always have a little bit of a disclaimer. I say, I may ask you some uncomfortable questions because I'm gonna be like a 4-year old, and I'm gonna ask why all the time. And what I'm trying to get to is the root cause, the root problem, right? So what that may look like, what that people problem may look like, is productivity, uh, turnover, um, morale, right? So those are all things that, uh, even though on the surface don't look like a process problem, may have roots down deep that process will solve. Uh, it's a hard question. It's that takes a little bit of time to get to in a quick conversation. If I'm just, if it's happy hour after the conference or whatever, that's where I need to get into that kind of in-person meeting with the leadership team. But there's so many far-reaching problems that are associated with those people. Productivity, I mean, bad training, right? For instance, I worked with a company. They do something very, without getting too much detail. They deal with some government agencies that have very specific protocols for data entry. And if you screw it up, you have to start all over again, right? Their their comment to me was, it takes, as I probed and asked, how long, this all sounds very interesting. How long does it take to learn how to do this? They said, well, someone will be up and running in about 3 years. I went, 3 years? That's a huge investment, right? If you're paying someone $50,000 a year, right? Just average benefits, all this stuff, and then to train them, and it takes 3 years, and you get 2.5 years down the road, and they go, you're not, listen, bud, you're just not going to cut it. That's too much of an investment, right? So let's shrink the time down by building a better process or better training process, so that we can get there faster, right? That's just one instance, but so it manifests in a couple different ways, but um, getting there in that initial cold conversation, or even warm conversation, that gets a little prying sometimes, and that gets a little intrusive. But you can see when they get engaged with it as well, right? As they start kind of dumping their guts to you, right? It's like, oh, like there's something going on here, right? The good thing is that when I get there, everybody has the problem. It's just, how do you, because the next step in that is they're interested, but how do I convert them now to really invest in solving their problem?
Great. What? Thank you again. Thank you so much for being so thorough and explaining the context of it. No, because it's again, such a common issue. It's like we get into a conversation, the clock is ticking, unless it's something you're very comfortable with, right? And even then, I'm going to speak for myself, even then it can feel uncomfortable because we don't want to impose on our friends either, right?
Right.
So one way to approach this, one way to kind of uh, kind of reverse this polarity basically is to start out a conversation. There's a little bit of a guess, right? There's a little bit of a guess, and ultimately, until you're in a real conversation with somebody, you're not going to truly understand their own real pain points, the way they perceive them, whatever, right? So there's nothing that really replaces that. You certainly want to get there. But to your point, the trick is, how do you just grease the wheels of that conversation so that it's not you trying to like guess the right thing, right? And just say, here's what I do. And then it's so easy to become all about us, about our process. And most of the time, they don't care about that stuff, right? They just don't
Right.
care. And so, one way to do this, if you haven't already done it, if you have, I'd love to hear how that might have worked for you, is you start out with um, more of a quick, oh, it's almost like a narrative, right? So it could be framed as, let's say you're at a networking event, or you just did a talk or something like that, whatever it is. Somebody comes up to you, you're having a conversation, they ask what do you do? Like, that's as cold as it gets, right? What do you do? And it's
Yeah.
so you're so it's so like tempting just to be like, well, I'm in, process documentation, and it's like, you know
That's it.
yeah. And it's no offense to what you do, but to your point, they're not in process documentation, right? If I talked about, my wife doesn't even know what I do. I mean, like I tell her I'm in marketing, it's like, ugh, her eyes roll back, right? One way to approach it is, instead of even worrying about describing your role or title or any of that stuff, right? Is really looking at it as almost like, how, if they're like, say they're a target audience, so it's not just it's not a just a random person, right? You could even share it as like, how with these kinds of companies you have these productivity issues, or they have these turnover issues, or they have these morale issues, however you want to describe it. I'm butchering it to a degree, right? Because I haven't had time to really craft it. But it's
Sure.
like, you're almost like how this situation happens, and it kind of looks like this, and then the impact of it is winds up, you wind up losing, 20% of your workforce. Whatever the details are there. Now all of a sudden you're in a situation where you're describing something not super narrow, but narrowly enough where if they have that problem, you will have their attention. I mean, if you talk to somebody and you describe a problem in a way that's totally from their perspective, It has nothing, you're not giving them titles and this is what I do and this is how long I've been doing it. You're starting with, you know how like CEOs of startups often really the thing they just hate doing is blank. Again, just as an example. If they have no idea what you're talking about, they're not a prospect
Right.
to some degree, right? Doesn't mean they
Yeah.
maybe they're just tired and they didn't pay attention, but for the most part, and that works when you're even reaching out to somebody on LinkedIn or you just change the context of the message, right?
Nice.
But essentially, it's starting more from let's just stay totally in their world. And you're taking a little bit of a guess on how they might phrase the problem, but you're trying to phrase the problem from that ideal client's perspective. And it'll take some nuance and it'll take some iterations for sure. So there might be 17 versions of this before you feel like you're starting to really get it dialed in. But the point of that is you're taking the pressure off yourself to try to maintain their interest through your engaging story about the how you solve it. Because a lot of times, again, they're not there yet. They don't even know what you solve and why it would matter to them. But if you start with this kind of however you can tell the story of this ideal client, this problem that they have, the impact that it has, and then it can be something as simple as, what I do is I work with CEOs to improve their processes and training so they can make sure that they're closing that gap in their whatever. And again, the language, don't worry about the language right now. But does that kind of gel as far as like how you might start framing the introduction to that conversation so that you can get them either going, "Oh, that's great. Nice to meet you." And then they walk off and you're like, "Okay, whatever," right? Or they're like, "Huh." Now all of a sudden they're paying attention. They might ask like, "Well, what does that look like?" Now you're in a conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And it's that hook, right? It's that hook to get them on the path that you want them on, right? So that they can start to tell their story. No, I like that. I definitely haven't done it. I'm gonna give it a try.
Oh, and that's great. And again, it's like, sometimes of course I don't know what somebody has done before, right? So I could say
Yeah.
something, you'd be like, well, duh, I read that in a book. None of this stuff, by the way, is anything I invented, full disclosure. Uh,
Right.
but just thinking in terms of like, even let's say you're doing a cold outreach, right? And it could even start with something as soft as saying, hey, I don't know if this is a good fit. Because that's honest, you don't know. I don't know if this is
Right.
even an issue for you, but you know, do you find that you have this blah 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 blah? If somebody has, and one way to think of it is yourself as your guinea pig, right? If somebody were this exact thing that you're talking about, or something that's really top of mind for you, rather than even somebody coming out and saying, "Hey, what keeps you up at night?" Well, politics, whatever.
Yeah. What doesn't?
Yeah, but if somebody were to reach out and you have something you just really, you're in this beautiful space right now. We talked about this beautiful part of your home, right? Let's say there was a leak in the roof and but it's a very complex roof because it's open beams and all that. And somebody at that moment just magically knew to reach out to you and they specialize in these log cabin and they're like, "Hey, do you ever experience it where this beautiful roof suddenly starts failing?" And you're like, "Yes. Oh my God, yes, please come over." Now all of a sudden you're gonna have a conversation. It's not the best example, but you get what I'm saying, right?
Right.
You
Well, I
know.
think it's good because I think that for some, especially for someone like me, um, and I mean, straight up insecurities that I sometimes experience when when there's this intimidating group of people scattered around the room, right? I like that. I think that's it's scripted, but not, but very quickly gets away from that scripted or practiced intro. Um, that can be so daunting because I mean once I'm over that bump, then I'm usually fine. Uh, it's getting over that bump into that realm that I'm comfortable in.
I'm exactly the same way. My favorite type of client interactions or with somebody that's new is just where I just happen to ask an open-ended question. They're just telling me everything. I'm just like, "Oh, this is beautiful. Like it's lovely, right?" That's all I want to do is just create that space. But getting somebody to want to open up about it, that's the big trick. And I think one of the key here things here is to be comfortable with, or try to get comfortable with the notion that not everybody's going to be a prospect, and that's cool. Like when you meet somebody, you reach out to somebody, there's going to be a lot more people that have no idea what you're talking about and don't care, or it's just not a top of mind issue, or it's not a high priority, whatever it is. That's fine. Because again, it might not be, the timing might not be right now, but it might be right in 3 months. So you certainly want to still keep up with people. And that's where it gets into systems and things. But just
Yeah.
as far as a philosophy, right? It's like you're going out there in the world with however you're approaching people, whether it's online or in person, whatever, with this kind of notion of this act of generosity, right? I'm here to try to help people solve some very specific problems. Is this something that you feel is a problem? If they don't, cool. Like you don't have to feel any pressure to try to convince them that they have the problem, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And then you can kind of let that go. So it's a starting point. It's just more of like the details that I mentioned earlier. Forget it. Like that, how I explained it is mishmash. It's more about just the framing of you're really just starting with, explaining a scenario that they might relate to, that they might actually feel, oh yeah, so whatever that scenario looks like. And it could be different for different people. So hypothetically, if you were reaching out to very targeted people like in an outreach, you might modify this based on the person. You might,
Yeah.
hey, you realize this company, is dealing with some issue that you're aware of ahead of time. Of course, now you're able to modify it, make it as customized as possible.
Yeah.
So one thing I wanted to finish up with you too is you mentioned at the beginning of or before we hit record, that the other thing is like getting it right. Like, you thought about your messaging on your website, right? And like,
Yeah.
I thought it was this, but now it's this. I want to hear more about that, but I also want to just, mention that what we just talked about really influences that as well,
Yeah.
right? Because you're starting again from their perspective and you're making a choice of, hey, I know I could solve a million different problems, but I can only really communicate one at a time.
Yeah. 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 So, I think that one of my big struggles was because I feel like there's a wide application for what I do, um, and it's really industry agnostic, right? It works everywhere, but it was, where is that messaging? What does it need to be focused on? What's the how do I make get the hook, or get people interested, get people to read further down the page, get them to click the contact me button, and stressing about making sure that that message was right. And I just reread. Don't go to my website right now, but I just went to it and I read it, and I'm like, what was I thinking when I did this? It's it's too complicated. It's too wordy. It just needs to be simplified. But the framework was there, and so I'm in the process of changing all that. But not thinking, I didn't beat myself up terribly bad, but like I certainly didn't. I spent too much time on it. I should have gone more with my gut, kept it simple, and just known that, hey, in 3 or 4 weeks, go in and fix it, or go in and tweak it, right? And then tweak it again, and go get on this maybe regular cadence of tweaking it until I really like it. I think I'm probably on my third tweak now, where I think it will be pretty good. It'll be better, right? As long as it's getting better, right? It's progress, not perfection. Uh,
100% for sure.
yeah, just don't beat myself up about it. But the other thing is also, just like I would ask other, just what I would ask my clients to engage with me, right? I don't have to do it all myself. There are people like you out there that specialize in this type of stuff. Whether it doesn't matter if it's marketing or legal or whatever HR, whatever it is. That's the other thing. I thought that I had to do it all myself, um, and so. One of the things I'm really glad that you and I connected is that you've already helped me. This has been amazing. Even just watching some of your other videos were absolutely amazing. When I said, oh my gosh, look at this. I got to do this. I got to do this. I got to do this. And I know that it wasn't wholesale change. It was just tweak, tweak, tweak down through the steps to make it better.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for that. I mean, that's the the nicest compliment I can get. I mean, that's the whole thing is again, we're just trying to help people solve their problems, right? Solve
Yeah.
a challenge. And I just so appreciate that you took the time to watch the videos that and because we put a lot of time into this, right? The other thing I want to share too is like you are not alone. Don't beat yourself up. I am constantly looking at my stuff and going, ugh, and I'll tell you exactly a good example of this. And I should know better, right? I'm like the marketer guy, right? And I'm always like talking about people like not being too broad and not being generic. Like a few months ago, when I was really making a pivot toward focusing primarily on the coaching and advising side and a little less on the content creation for company side, I'm like, this show actually that we're on right now was originally called Attract Your Ideal Customers. And it was geared toward founders. Well, founders is everybody, right? So me, who like if anybody should know better than to do that, we all do it, right? It's all iteration. So you can know what you know, and it's all exploration, it's experimentation, and the main thing to your point is there's always progress, not perfection. It's iteration, it's little tweaks. That's what I really like to focus on with people. It's not about going in and tell them they're doing stuff wrong. Like, hey, who wants to hear that? It's not like, oh, here's how you should do it. Here's your 10 steps. It's like you could read a book and learn that, right? What it's
Right.
about is like, hey, here's your starting point. And how do we keep tweaking? It's like the airplane trying to hit New York to LA. It's like there's constant, changing slight course corrections, right?
Right.
And so back to the thing about, now let's get practical about it. When you think about your landing, I'm assuming you're meaning like your homepage and when people first come in, right?
Yep.
So kind of the same philosophy or viewpoint that we were talking about earlier, right? One of the biggest challenges with making it the language, whether it's something you're saying to somebody in person or on a Zoom call or whatever, versus on your website, it's still the same perspective in the sense that it's about them. They're the hero. I'm not the hero. You're not the hero. They are the hero, right? They're on this journey. You are there as the guide. And this is Donald Miller, full disclosure. If people listening, this is all like, building your story brand stuff, right? So
Oh, okay.
there's a book called Building Your Story Brand by Donald Miller that he did this great concept of like creating your messaging, creating your marketing based on this kind of narrative framework on a story. And so he breaks it down saying like you have the character or the hero, you have the guide, think Obi-Wan Kenobi to Luke Skywalker kind of thing, right? We're the guide, right? We're not the hero. And then the solution is like how you get them to, how you're going to help them blow up the Death Star, basically, right? But when you're thinking of it in terms of like, what does that mean when you're trying to create the messaging for your website? One of the hard parts about expressing something in their perspective, the hero's perspective, telling their story to them in a way that they're going, oh my God, that's exactly what I'm dealing with, right? Is that you have to make hard decisions because we all can solve lots of different problems. And which one do you pick? Right. So, what a lot of people default to is, oh, I don't want to have to choose. I'm just going to talk about myself. Right. So, I can't really say up front what problem they have that I can solve because I haven't talked to them yet. So, I'll just talk about how passionate I am about marketing and how many years of experience. Well, now we've lost them, right? Because it's totally about me instead of them. So, one way to approach this is to look at it and say, okay, again, just like the initial conversation, there might be one or two problems that really overlap with most of your client interactions. And that problem is not the only problem you can solve for them by any stretch, but it's a good starting point for a conversation, right? So, everybody coming in, hopefully most people that are your ideal client type would see that problem expressed in their perspective with the impact of that problem and then some kind of invitation for them to learn more about how to solve it. Now they're in, right? Now they're engaged in reading and all that. And if you get them in a conversation, based on that problem, based on that narrower kind of approach, now you have the opportunity to find out about all the other ways that this impacts them. Now you can talk to them about they're sharing with you all these other sub problems or related problems. Awesome. Your engagement with them as a client might have nothing to do with the first problem. Or you might just figure out or share with them, oh, let's not start there. We need to start here, right?
Yeah.
But the point of that is that it's doing its job in the sense that it's getting the conversation started. What are your thoughts on it? Is any of that kind of gelling with you or vibing with you at all?
Yeah. Um, I think that it's, that, framing it, putting it in their, in kind of putting the ball in their court with, as I think that's the way I understood it is, and letting them, let them open it, right? So that then you can it's tough, right? It's tough to visualize it, especially, for me, right? Like for me, I'm a process person, so I like to go from step one to step two to step three. And I know that there's variation, and I know that there's choice or decision uh, on the fly. Some of that stuff is hard, right? Some of that stuff is hard. But certainly it's definitely a learning process, and it's definitely getting them to like you said, to be that hero. I really like what you said about being the guide. I actually wrote that down. Guiding them through this process is that's an important part for me, because I'm not coming in and telling you what to do, right? That's what I had. I had that question come. Well, how are you going to tell me how to do this? I said, I'm not going to tell you how to do this. You're going to tell me how. You're going to tell me how you currently do it, and we're going to make it better. And so that was a key thing for them was they were afraid like that I was going to come in and just try and wreck what they were not try, but wreck what they were doing because I had no experience. But that's not what it was. It was a guiding process, not um, and it was almost at that point when they heard me say that, right? They were like, oh, now this makes sense, right? You're just going to help me down the path.
So it's interesting though, what you just said that when they hear you say that, and I'm getting that you're saying that that's happened before, right? When you're explaining to them, I'm not coming in with a bulldozer and gonna break everything and then tell you how to do it differently. I'm here to help you discover, right?
It happens almost every time.
Almost every time. Now, here's the question for you. Think about, is that expressed in some way on your website?
No.
One area to start with, right? So you're in a lot of ways, you're just v- almost like imagining a conversation with somebody, right? Like the perfect conversation with the perfect client, the person you just know is going to get the most value from what you do, right? And you're just thinking about like, what are they going to be like? you know? And you're never going to get it all right, right? You're certainly not going to guess for everybody because people are complex. We're all complicated. So you're never going to get it. There's no perfection here, even after years, right? It's
Right. Yeah.
always a
Right.
best guess, and you tweak and you tweak. But these little things, you have all this experience, just think about ways that you can say, yeah, this is stuff that comes up a lot in my conversations. Okay, cool. How do you express that in your marketing, in your website, whatever the marketing is, on your LinkedIn page, in a post, you do an episode of something about it, you do like whatever it is. Um, it can even be something that you bring up at the beginning. That kind of introduction kind of, hey, you know how sometimes this happens, and you can even say, and one of the things that frustrates them is they talk to people like me and they're coming in with a bulldozer and they're like, they don't need that. You can even introduce it that early where you're differentiating how you do it because they might have already talked to people that do something similar. Consultants are going to come in and tell us how to run our business, right? So these little things, the common theme to all this is empathy, right? There's no magic
Oh, for
wording,
sure.
right? It's all the best of your ability, taking your experience with people and just thinking about like, how do I best guess, get into their head and be able to express what I do in a way that they're like nodding their heads and going, yeah, 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 I totally relate to this. And then it's about backing off and just shutting up and letting them talk and share what's going on. And now you're off to the races, right?
Right. Yeah. No, I think it's cool. I think it's because you know talking with you about this is kind of the exact same thing that I do as I hear myself say it. The same thing is happening. I want them to hear them say that they have a problem, and I want them to hear that it's a bigger problem than they want to admit, right? Similar to me, right? I have this cold intro problem, or I have this, what's my message and things like that. But talking through it, right, is now just it's just opening some other doors. It's really, it's the same thing that I do. We're just in a different context.
100%. And it's really the commonality as I see it is there's different mindsets when it comes to whatever advising or coaching or anything like that, whatever you want to call it, right? It's like basically it's the difference between realizing that like we don't know them like they know them, right? We might have, I like to think of myself as a subject matter expert. I've been doing marketing for 20 something years, right? Like I like to think I know what I'm talking about, but I don't know you as well as you know you, right?
Right.
So the worst thing I could possibly do in this context or any other is be like, listen to you for 5 minutes and go like, okay, here's your problem, buddy. You know,
Yeah.
I'm gonna, hey, guess what? Good luck. Good for you. We connected because I'm gonna fix you.
Yeah.
Like, no, thanks. So it's really a philosophical thing, right? So the mechanics, the what do you say? That'll come. And it's not, I don't want to say it's easy, but the hardest part is where you're already at, which you've already done, which is the perspective of like, look, yes, I have ideas. I'm gonna have ideas all day long, and they might talk, and I can tell. Oh, I want to jump in and just tell them exactly. But that's not what it's about, right? It's if somebody, if I were to sit here right now in this context, or even privately, not on a podcast, and tell you exactly what you just shared with me, unlike it would be pretty likely that it would just be like, if, right, okay, whatever,
Yep.
right? So it's not about even the content so much, it's about the aha moment that you mentioned earlier. It's like just that I like to say for myself, it's like my favorite thing about this work or even selling is I love helping people see new solutions and possibilities. That doesn't mean telling them, that means helping them see it,
Right.
right? Now
Right.
the challenge is how do you take that mentality, that philosophy, and how do you apply that to something like a web page? It's hard, right? Because it's easier to do this in real life. But just if you maintain that framework, right? If you just think like, how would I do this? If it's like, yeah, it's not a dialogue yet, but how can I still retain that the spirit of it, right? I that approach will hopefully get you a lot closer to what you're going to be happier with. Whatever it is that you write, hopefully is going to be a lot closer to what you're looking for.
Yeah. Yeah. It's I like that spirit, right? Like what is
Mhm.
it? Where's the heart of it? And the guide and that I love that. And that's I'm certainly going to employ that not only in conversations but website and LinkedIn and all that mind-numbing marketing stuff that that
How
I just
dare
go,
you,
oh,
sir?
do I have to do it? Do I have to do this marketing thing again? Do I have to concentrate on this again?
Yeah, yeah, and I get it. I get it. Like I was telling you before we hit record, like, people in my family don't even really truly understand what I do because they don't care. Like they care about me, but they don't care about marketing. And I'm like a nerd about this stuff, but that's the other thing. It's just remember, not everybody's a nerd about the stuff we are nerds about. That's why they hire us, right?
That's right.
Yeah. If
Yeah.
they were into it the way we were, they wouldn't need us. Uh,
Yeah.
But I'll leave you with not to give you like, it's, again, stuff to read, but we just talked about that framework from Donald Miller. That's a great book. And for people listening, that's a great book. If you haven't read it and you haven't checked it out, that building a story brand, it's as you know, uh, kind of user friendly as it gets when it comes to thinking about marketing, and I'd highly recommend it. And ultimately, leaving you with, first of all, thank you so much for being so candid and so transparent and so generous with your own things that you're challenged with. And I hope people listening that have a similar issue can go, oh yeah, I can relate to that. It's not just us, right? It's not just me. But I really, really appreciate that you took the time to do this. And I hope that not only was it beneficial in the moment, but that as you think of stuff, the invitation for you and I to reconnect just as buddies and you kind of pick my brain, it is open to you. And I really appreciate that you took the time.
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate your help and the invitation, and it's always fun. It's always fun having a conversation. There's a lot of times nowadays where conversation is a typed or and it's so much more fun and more productive to speak with somebody. Podcasts I think are awesome, and I think it's a great way to put the message out there. And for sure, I definitely got plenty out of this, and I'm going to go apply some of it and keep on tweaking, because the marketing is a process too, right? So it's there's a way to get it done, right? So I appreciate it.
Special thanks to Darby Walsh for sharing his challenges around initiating conversations with new prospects and exploring alternative strategies for having sales conversations that are enjoyable and productive for everyone involved. If you enjoyed the show, I hope you'll consider subscribing and leaving a review. And don't forget to visit marcusschaller.com/subscribe for weekly troubleshooting guides and tips to help you find and fix the weak spots in your marketing that are holding you back, fine-tune your positioning and marketing strategy, and start growing again by attracting more of your ideal clients. Again, that's marcusschaller.com/subscribe.